Hi, everybody. Welcome to Mormonish. I'm Rebecca.
And I'm Landon.
And we could not be more thrilled or excited about our guest today. This is kind of like a dream scenario that kind of fell in our lap. Landon's already going, yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes. We have the amazing Laurie Lee Hall. How are you today?
Doing great, Rebecca.
Yeah, we are just absolutely thrilled to be able to talk to you. And for those in our audience, if there are any that are not familiar with Laurie Lee, you will soon find after we read her bio why we were so excited about this episode. And I should say, let's have Landon read the bio first, and then I will say.
Okay. Laurie Lee Hall's growing up years were defined by the conflict between her physical condition as a boy and her inherent identity as a girl. Unable to explain or resolve her gender dysphoria, she committed to living her adult life as a male. She joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, eventually becoming chief architect of its temples and an ecclesiastical leader. In her church and community, rigid adherence to gender roles is not only the norm, but the defining issue of a faith that doctrinally declares one's gender as an eternal identity. Against this traditional backdrop, Hall finally received spiritual confirmation and personally accepted that she was transgender and always had been. In this remarkable memoir, Laurie Lee details how she risked everything to live true to her long-suppressed gender identity. Through the power of lived experience, Laurie Lee's story affirms the reality of gender identity and the strength and joy of self-acceptance. And that book that we're talking about is the book that is coming out November 20th, and it's called Dictates of Conscience. And so we actually just interviewed Laurie Lee about the book. We'll be airing that here in the future.
Closer to when the book drops, I think.
Yeah.
And that was an amazing, amazing interview that we did again at Signature Books. Remember, we sometimes will do that because they're so wonderful over there, and Barbara Brown allowed us to come in and tape. So yeah, we dive into the book and more stories about the book. But you may be able to guess from that bio why we're so excited to have this interview. And that good. Everybody hold them up at the same time. There we go.
And I didn't read the
thing
subtitle, which is
right.
From Mormon High Priest to My New Life as a Woman, which is quite the subtitle. Not many people can make that claim.
Yep. Quite the provocative subtitle. That's right. No, we're just absolutely thrilled. And this book is getting incredible reception. It is not even out yet. It's in pre-order. So everybody stop what you're doing and go pre-order. And we were just talking about it's already what position at this point?
Number 9.
It's already number 9, and it's not coming out for a month. So this is highly anticipated, which is wonderful. And we were so excited to have that opportunity to have that conversation, which will be airing later. But today we are going to talk more professional talk, because you may have caught from that bio, Chief Temple Architect. And you can imagine how much Landon and I would like to, delve into this and just get some of the backstory on this. So I just thank you so much for coming on to talk about this and splitting this into 2 parts, because we initially thought, we'll do the one interview and kind of cover everything. But even Barbara Brown was like, there's so much there. We might need to break this up so that we can kind of focus. And I think this will be really effective and really interesting to do it this way. So I guess just start out by explaining, kind of professionally how you chose this profession. How did this happen? How did you become the chief architect for the LDS Church? This is just amazing.
It was a journey that I never anticipated could happen, but I made up my mind that I would be an architect when I was 14. I don't know what possessed me to want to be an architect, other than it felt like a great combination of the things that really interested me as a kid. I hadn't ever met an architect. I really wasn't sure what architects did, but I knew I wanted to be one. But settling on that at age 14 and then developing a tenacity for preparing myself for architectural school is what carried me through high school. And I had always been an artist. I'd always been interested in design. I loved historical things, historic architecture. In my artwork that I did in my teen years, it was always buildings and, especially historic buildings around the New England town where I grew up. I just loved all of those things. And my portfolio that I put together of my artwork and my various other studies in high school garnered me a full scholarship at Rensselaer Polytechnic in upstate New York, the School of Architecture there being one of the best in the country. One time at Rensselaer, when we were in studio late one night, my friend who had introduced me to the LDS Church and I were sitting at our drafting boards and working on whatever project we were supposed to be working on. And the conversation came up, gee, wouldn't it be great to someday work on the design of a temple? And I thought to myself, well, I just joined the church a few months before, and I thought to myself, there is no way that that's ever going to happen. Ever, ever, ever. And I felt just too new to this faith and too far away from Utah or whatever that it just seemed impossible that it would occur. But the time came in my journey, which is detailed in the memoir, that I wanted to contribute my talents and abilities to in some fashion to the LDS Church. And that ultimately caused us to move our family from upstate New York, where I'd gotten my education and started a family, to living in Utah, and receiving a position at church headquarters as a project manager in the Welfare Services Department, and ultimately the manager of the design and construction section for welfare, working on Welfare Square and Desert Industry stores and things like that. Over a period of time, I found myself moved over to the meeting house program and initially meeting house construction, and ultimately was assigned as a new director for the Worldwide Meeting House Standard Plan program, in which we developed the core program and documents that I believe are still in effect today, 25 years later, in the building of meeting houses around the world. And
so the fact that we can identify an LDS church wherever we go, as you're driving down the street and you go, that's LDS, and you can see it. That's you.
That's a lot of that's me. And of course, meeting houses are one type of construction and architecture. Some of the listeners may recall President Hinckley stood up in the early 2000s in General Conference and said something referring to how wonderful it was that the church was building so many meeting houses. At that point, I think we were dedicating one every day somewhere in the world. And which would mean somewhere around 360 new meeting houses coming online somewhere in the world each year. And then he described what the meeting houses were like. And he said, we get a lot of concerns and complaints that the meeting houses all look very similar. Or as Landon said nicely, they're very recognizable. And he said, they are. They're very repetitive. And President Hinckley said, isn't that great? That was what he wanted, and that was what was efficient and effective for the church at that time. After 5 years of working in that program, I was given the opportunity to be the director of construction for all temples worldwide. And it spells out in the memoir again how these things took place. And so I won't spoiler any of that tonight. But and then when the City Creek Mall was started, a lot of our staff, including my colleague who was at the time the director of temple design, were all reassigned to work on that mall. And we had an opening in temple design. And I went to my managing director at the time and I said, do you think it could work out that I could be assigned to direct both temple design and temple construction, which I already had, and do both of them and look for ways to be more effective and efficient in producing temple designs and temple construction. And ultimately, the presiding bishopric approved that, which doubled my workload on the spot. But for the years 2007 through 2013, I was the director of both temple construction and temple design worldwide in the physical facilities program.
Can I ask you
Yeah.
a question real quick? Because I didn't realize this. This was kind of a revelation what you just said. I knew that the church had used, interest from tithing to bail out the City Creek Mall. I did not know that that it was church architects that were working on the City Creek Mall. It was not a commercial
Well,
venture all
like
along.
right, like all of our really massive projects at church headquarters, there were a group of us, myself included, for example, if we're talking about temples for a moment, and then the same thing is true about City Creek Center. The church hires outside consultants to, do most of the development of designs and plans and so forth. But the work is directed and managed by employees at church headquarters who, like myself in my assignments, represent the owner's interests in managing the work of all of these outside consultants. On a project as large as the City Creek Center, 2 major firms were contracted to do design, and several major construction companies were involved in the design, ultimately all directed and managed by church employees representing the leadership of the church and the church's interests, owners' representatives, if you will.
Okay, I did not
That's
know
so
that.
interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that either, to get that behind the scenes look. And that's why we're here, right?
Right.
So many things that we don't know about how this all, yeah, I know.
So, for example, when I talk about 07 to 13 being the director of temple design worldwide, that often meant that I was the first person touching a design. It often meant that I was setting the concept for that design. It always meant that I was the one who was taking everybody's work and holding it up to the first presidency and saying, how's this look? Do you feel good about this? Okay, approved, run back and get the troops running on it. So that was my role. So in no large project does any one person do the design, any more than that happens in any major corporate endeavor these days. But at the end of the day, for a season, I was the person who was standing in front of the first presidency and others and saying, this is what we propose to do in this location.
So President Nelson doesn't wake up in the middle of the night and sketch something out and bring it to you and say, this is what it's supposed to look like. You guys develop designs and present them, and then they pick from those.
In my years of working with President Nelson when he was a member of the Quorum of the 12, that never happened. We worked together. He was the chairman of the Missionary Executive Committee at the time that we designed and developed the expansion of the Provo Missionary Training Center. And that was all deferred to us, and we brought it to them, and he brought it up, in that case, to the first presidency. President Hinckley was probably, of the 3 church presidents that I worked with, the one most likely to sketch something on a napkin and hand it to whoever the chief architect was at the time and explain the concept and then say, make this work. I never had that experience with him, although I did do a number of projects for President Hinckley. But I know that's the origin of the floor plan of the 45 very small temples that were built in the late 1990s was a sketch that President Hinckley did that said, this is all we need to do a temple and to do the ordinances that are, the essential components of the temple plan. And that's why those buildings are so compact and efficient, because they match his original sketch.
Yeah, we've done some podcasting about the Hinckley Temple plan, and it is pretty amazing how he wanted everyone to have access, and he wanted to have a smaller neighborhood temple that everybody could go to. Can you kind of explain sort of the steps in order? Is a location chosen, then an announcement, then a design? Is there an announcement, then a location, then a design, or does it kind of vary? I think a lot of people don't understand how that works.
Right. In the 55 or 60 temple site selections and temple developments that I was involved with, probably any of those conditions could be identified, as having been followed. In Paris, France, for example, way back in the 1990s, President Hinckley was talking to the Parisian saints, the French saints, that a temple would be built in Paris. For the next 10 years, we searched for a city that would work for us, work with us, and that had a piece of property that we could purchase to then develop the temple. So in that case, kind of pre-announcement led to a site selection process that was extraordinarily lengthy in that particular case. More often than not, sites are searched in advance of the announcement. Mm-hmm. And I guess for our listeners, I need to point out that time frame that I was involved with this from 2003 to 2013, those 10 years, that's what I'm referring to, how it worked then. Mm-hmm. I cannot speak to how it works now. With the huge number of announcements that are taking place, my guess is it's very different from what I'm about to describe. So I'm going to describe the 2003 to 2013 way of doing it, under President Hinckley and President Monson as presidents of the church. So typically, we would be advised of where the First Presidency was considering announcing a temple. We would then form a site search team, and I was often involved with that, along with someone from church real estate, and perhaps another one of my companions, my colleagues from temple design and construction, and perhaps someone local to the site if it was particularly if it was a foreign site and we needed to kind of find our ways around. Once we identified what we felt were the perhaps number 1 and 2 and 3 best sites in terms of size, configuration, visibility, access to utilities, all of the technical things, all the due diligent things that you do in real estate, we would bring those forward through the various temple committees and ultimately to the First Presidency. Under President Hinckley, he really liked, even in his advanced years, he really liked to step on the ground before a temple was announced and pronounced for that particular parcel. President Monson had less interest in doing that much traveling and that much stepping on the dirt. But in one case, in the case of the Payson Temple, we had 2 sites, and one of them was the proposed recommended site by certain members of our team, and the other site was proposed and recommended by others. And we thought, well, since it's close and we can get the brethren down to the First Presidency by car down to Payson, we'll show both of them and allow President Monson to make a choice. Not something we regularly did, but it was available and we could make that work. And we went to the first site and he looked out the window and wasn't too excited or impressed. We went to the second site where the temple now stands. He got out of the car in that case, walked over to the ground and looked around and felt really good about it. And he said, let's build it here. And so that's where the Payson Temple stands today. But there's a variety of ways that we got to the point where most typically the land was procured and identified as the temple site before an announcement took place. In more recent history, I just happened tonight to drive by the newly dedicated Layton Temple up in Layton, Utah, which was a property I stood on and helped select as the temple site probably 12 to 15 years ago.
Really? Because we just had the open house there.
Exactly.
Went to that.
Well in advance of the announcement and then subsequent design and construction, we purchased that property And I think the same is true of Syracuse, which has just, I think, recently been announced.
Yeah, you were right down the street from me.
That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah, Landon
live
can
in
almost look out his
Syracuse, yep.
window and see that.
we were on those properties some time ago, identifying them before they be, particularly in these areas in Utah, which development is moving very quickly. If the church
Right.
didn't own property in communities where 15 to 20 years from now we might build a temple, the church was interested in purchasing sufficient ground for a temple site, totally confidentially, and then banking that until such time as an announcement would be made.
I was going to ask, because isn't that somewhat, I mean, if that site leaks out, in Utah especially, that real estate around it's pretty valuable.
Yes.
Did you, did it leak out? Did people know, or was it locked in the granite vault up the canyon so no one knew where it was going?
By the way, I also did a renovation of the granite vault, so yeah, I've been back in there. Yeah. No, I can't recall one where we really tripped up and it got out ahead of time. There may have been a few people, locally involved in the transaction who perhaps were told to keep this quiet, but obviously certain people would know what it's for. I remember I took a church motor pool car from Salt Lake at church headquarters up to Rexburg, Idaho, before the Rexburg, Idaho temple was announced, so that I could tour the site just south of the BYU Idaho campus and understand, the particulars of the site so we could develop the design. And that was an afternoon, an afternoon somewhat in the midweek, I think. And I was, it was just a white Chevy Impala with Utah plates. But by the evening, the word had spread all over campus that somebody from church headquarters was looking at ground, south of the campus. And, the rumor mill started chirping. And shortly thereafter, the temple was announced. So I had to be careful on a lot of the visits that I made to places. Oftentimes between site acquisition and construction, I was on the road, 1 week out of every month, and serving at that time as I did as a stake president, and having everyone in our area of our little town in Tooele know what I did for work. If I was missing on a given weekend, people all wanted to know where I was.
Yeah.
And I can remember when we visited the Kansas City temple site, again, prior to the announcement. Kansas City, as I noted in my book, is a particularly sensitive subject because it was in Western Missouri, and all that means, by way of legend in the world of the Latter-day Saints. So I called home that night to say goodnight to my family, and my spouse at the time asked me, "So where are you?" And she knew that I wasn't going to say, but I said, "Well, I'm at supper right now, enjoying some of the best barbecue in all the United States. But, I'm not going to tell you exactly where." And, she got to thinking, "Oh, is this Texas? Is this Arkansas?
Right.
Where is this?" She never did guess Kansas City. But anyway.
So even your spouse couldn't know where you were during these.
It wasn't because she couldn't keep a secret. It's that, why would I want to put her in that position, where other people would be asking?
Ask her.
Same reason why I didn't tell her, if I had a sensitive interview on a given night, I wasn't going to put her in that position. My counselors never knew where I was. I just said, "Your guys are in charge this weekend. I'm gone to parts unknown." And it might have been, Atlanta or Lisbon. It just, nobody knew.
Wow.
Yeah.
Can I ask, just going back to when you said that, President Hinckley came and saw the site, and President Monson, did you get the feeling that they're receiving revelation that this was the place, or was it more of it's a business decision? I like this property just like anyone who's buying a house or whatever would say, yeah, I kind of like this place best.
I really sense that both of them had we're seeking for spiritual insight, seeking for kind of the vision of what it could be. There's a very fine line between envisioning and having a vision. And I promise you that in those days that I was designing temples, that line was extremely fine even for myself. As I'd look at property and try to envision what could occur there, it was really close call as to whether this is a spiritual experience and a visioning experience, or is this envisioning using all of my professional know-how. But at the end of the day, I definitely felt the influence of divinity in helping to make these things happen. But it's a very fine line. It's not the heavens opening and the sun shining and the choir singing, but it's kind of utilizing all your talents and your sensitivities and your spiritual eyes and ears as well. Was how I felt about it. And I know how my colleagues and staff felt about it.
Was there ever a time where you said, "Ooh, bad decision"?
Yes, there were a few. There was a certain member of our selection team that was convinced that this hilltop in Lisbon, Portugal, needed to be the temple site. It was a prominent location. You could see it from quite a distance. One of the challenges is just down the hill where the road went by, across the street was a glass recycling plant. Mm-hmm. And all day long, heavy trucks were driving into that. And you could hear the glass being dumped into the crusher. And you could hear that clanking and churning taking place. And I was asked if I could build a wall tall enough to prevent that sound. But at the end of the day, I said, no, that's not where we should be putting the temple. But my colleague really pushed it through our meetings to try to say, this is where the temple should be. Ultimately, that's not where the temple is. It was on the site that myself and some of my team preferred, that was down closer to the city and still in a prominent location, a smaller site, fairly compact and a little more urban feeling, but it didn't have a glass recycling plant next to it.
You could have crushed the glass and mixed it in with the mortar and made it.
That's right.
That's right. Like
we missed an opportunity.
Exactly. Was that a
clever
criteria? Was that something that it, instead of being like proximity to where most of the Latter-day Saints were, was it more visibility was also probably important, or
certainly certainly in many places visibility was an issue. President Monson particularly enjoyed announcing temples in prominent cities worldwide.
So everyone goes, oh,
right. Whether it's Paris when it finally did get formally announced, Moscow, or Rome, or all of these places. And in many of those cases, much like the Washington D.C. temple 50 years ago, and the Philadelphia temple that we built during our time frame, it's about the kind of statement icon of the church in prominent places. In other locations, we look closely at how, if you think of Latin American cities and so forth, we look closely at how members would actually travel to get to the temple in places where there weren't a lot of cars, at least at the time in which we were developing the temple, understanding how, public transportation routes worked and so forth, it was a useful tool. But that nothing about this effort can be painted with one paintbrush. There's so many different conditions. It's like algebra where you're trying to solve 3 equations with 27 variables and there is no solution. So you do it the best you can
for each situation. It seems like with the Hinckley and trying to build these 95 accessible, smaller temples that are focusing on people being able to attend and ordinances there, those had less of a focus on visibility. It seems to me those were more like, these are for the people. And then there are some statement temples where it's like, let's use these so people will say, what's that? who are the LDS people? And that makes sense. Like you said,
Yeah.
everyone's different.
Yeah. The small temples, of which there were 45, not 95.
Oh, that's right. 45. Sorry.
45.
I'm inflating it in my mind. 45.
Most of those, not all, but many of those were situated next to an existing meeting house or stake center, where land might be available already. You know, if the little temple could share a parking lot with the stake center, that saved the church money in President Hinckley's mind. And I think probably there was some truth to that, because temples are open and functioning, these little ones especially, when the meeting house wasn't in use. So, you know, some shared parking things going on. He loved that kind of stuff. And so, yes, they didn't wind up always in, you know, highway, religious, commercial kind of locations, like you often see if you drive anywhere around the South, where the big Baptist and I can't think of the other word, the big mega churches where those exist are typically along interstate freeways or major U.S. highways, you know, all over the South. I refer to that as highway religion. You know, it's being able to see this icon of a building, you know, as you drive by it at 65 miles an hour. Most Mormon temples didn't fall into that category, although San Diego, if you think of it, right there prominently on the I-5, and everybody looks at it and goes, oh my gosh, what is that? Same with Washington, D.C. temple. You come around the Beltway and all of a sudden it just kind of rises up out of the trees at you like the Emerald City. And, you know, those are great things as kind of iconic eyewitnesses to the church.
What was it always? Did they always put these in residential areas? Was that always a preference, or is that more of a recent phenomena to build these? And obviously, the smaller ones aren't quite as big a deal if they're in a residential area as some of these really large ones. What point, if they weren't, what point did that shift occur? And do you know why?
Yeah. So again, there's as many differences, many exceptions to whatever I'm going to say as there are rules. I would say most of the 45 little temples, like I said, wound up next to meeting houses or stake centers sharing parking. So those may have occurred in residential areas, but they also were so relatively innocuous that they weren't any bigger than someone's, you know, nice McMansion, and they were certainly not as tall as a two-story home. So they slipped in places, you know, in existing parking lots and all of that. The idea that there wasn't going to bring any additional traffic, those little temples were very easy to insert into whatever neighborhood we had already had permission to build a stake center or a meeting house. The next several temples that we built after that tended to be in non-residential areas. I'm thinking of San Antonio, Texas, and Newport Beach, California, Rexburg, that I mentioned next to the campus of BYU, Idaho. Sacramento Temple was built on a church recreation site. A lot of those temples were built in places that weren't immersed in communities. You know, a lot of the foreign temples, the temples overseas in Europe, are actually built in somewhat urban locations, not residential areas. For example, in Philadelphia, the church purchased city-owned redevelopment property that had served as a parking lot for some 40 years. And it being right along Vine Street, was a very prominent location, but not a residential location. Our context was a federal court building, the Catholic Diocese Basilica right across the street, you know, and other major office buildings and so forth on that edge of Philadelphia's downtown. So those, in that case, that's a 3-story temple with some fairly tall steeples. We were only asked not to let Moroni's head get above the top of the cross on the basilica. And so I actually did a drawing, took it to the city fathers, the mayor and his staff, and showed a cross section showing Vine Street, the Catholic Basilica, including its cross that we got from measuring that building and its plans and so forth, and the proposed temple and Moroni, and the fact that we were going to be 1 foot shorter than the cross. Yeah, and they said, okay, good, approved. It's it's that kind of thing. As I think about it, the church often finds a way to build, or found, again, I'm talking in the past, found a way to build on larger parcels that they then develop themselves into residential communities. For example, Twin Falls in Idaho, a 9-hole community golf course that was floundering was purchased by the church. And Bishop Burton, at the time the presiding bishop of the church, who was an avid golfer, questioned whether a golf course should be sacrificed to build a temple, but only tongue in cheek, of course. But anyway, that upon purchasing that 9-acre course, we set the temple in the midst and then laid it out so that a church development, in this case, City Creek Reserve, but Property Reserve or whatever they called themselves before the mall happened, developed the home lots around the temple. So the temple sat nicely in a new community or in a new little subdivision. We did the same thing in Kansas City. Kansas City Temple sits in the midst of a church designed and constructed for-profit neighborhood with the temple in the middle. And when we built the Ochre Mountain Temple, that's in Daybreak, burgeoning subdivision and a new community in South Jordan. We worked with Kennecott, Rio Tinto. I'm thinking of the parent company. We worked with Rio Tinto to identify the knoll upon which the Ochre Mountain Temple sits as being the prominent place for the temple. And in that case, they hadn't developed the phases of the subdivision around that part of the overall property. They were working in other areas of their property, but they were very fond of the idea that basically the Ochre Mountain Temple was going to become the hood ornament for the Daybreak community. And then over time, that part of the subdivision was developed very much centered around the temple property. And so it's really easy to go in and be the first on the block if you're going to be the temple. In other cases, like Draper, just across the valley, the church went into an existing subdivision that was being built and purchased all the home lots in the center of the subdivision's ring road. They were building the houses around the edges and they hadn't built any of the houses in the center. So we purchased all 12 lots in the center, and that's where the Draper Temple sits. But again, the temple was built in concert with the building of the houses around it. So people buying those homes were either aware that the temple was built there because it was already there, or purchased those homes because they wanted to be
because of the temple,
back close to the temple.
Yeah. And that's a big difference. I mean, I think in the temples that, the places where they're trying to build that Landon and I look at, it's an existing neighborhood and then suddenly a temple comes in, but people do watch this development around temples. I think of Erda, which I'm sure you're extremely familiar with. We're going to be doing an episode on that coming up where, it almost appears that since the town would not approve the housing, they wouldn't put the tent, the town said, just put the temple, not the housing. It was like a package deal, which some people could look at in a certain way and go, well, that's interesting. Why couldn't they just have a temple for their saving ordinances? Who cares about the housing? But it seems to be a package deal in a lot of ways, which I guess people say, well, protect the infrastructure, have a nice surroundings to protect the temple. But I don't know. I mean, what do you think? I think some more critical eye are like, that just seems like they're, in the real estate market and maybe the temple's secondary. I don't know. What do you think? I'm sure you've heard all these different ways to spin it.
Well, because I lived in Tooele for
Yeah.
almost 25 years and raised my family there, and was very aware of the original temple site because it was a church welfare alfalfa farm. So I knew that ground quite well. We talked about every year that we would send volunteers from our stakes in the valley to go help cultivate the alfalfa on that property. When it was announced as the original Tooele, Utah temple site, and I saw images, I was already living in Kentucky at that point, but when I saw images online of what they proposed to accomplish there, I thought bad fit, really bad fit, because the little community, the little unincorporated community of Erda doesn't have a domestic water system, doesn't have a sanitary sewer system. Its well water is sometimes a little on the briny side because it sits really low in relationship to the Great Salt Lake. The house lots that were being approved in Erda when I still lived there were 5-acre ranch lots, ranchettes, that had wells and their own septic systems. And I thought, how do you put that much development in a community that has zero infrastructure, is downhill from everything, in a community where, honest to goodness, development in Tooele was constrained by the fact that we didn't have enough water, to develop. The next houses couldn't be built until more water rights were found, or until somebody bought water from Kennecott Copper, who owned everything in the acres above us. So to me, it seemed like, much like the glass recycling plant in Lisbon, that Erda was a very bad idea. And, I know some of the people who live in Erda, and, they put their backs up enough so that everybody was ultimately able to realize that, hey, nice idea, but wrong place, wrong, just wrong in so many ways. And it moved to a place in Tooele that's at least supported by the Tooele city infrastructure.
Right. And then just existing housing, which I think is a very home. But it's interesting because it seems like you described, find a place, make sure it fits, work with cities. And now it almost seems to be put it here and then work it out or figure it out. Heber is an interesting one because unlike Erda with too little water, too much water, they announced it, they did the groundbreaking, and only then did they start looking at the water studies. We're pumping away millions of gallons of water on that site, and on Mormonish, we covered that. We, had
drawing down the aquifer for all of the surrounding property.
Yes, exactly. No, a nightmare. And I actually believe that location will be changed. I think they're starting to realize. We kept trying to, a lot of residents in Mormonish kept trying to say, this is crazy, this amount of water, there's got to be something better. So is there just like a difference now as far as put it here, let it be written, let it be done, and then work it out later, as opposed to what you're describing, where it seemed like they did due diligence ahead of time? I don't know. It kind of appears that way on the surface. I don't know if it really is.
It's hard to say, but it's hard to get too supportive when you see these mistakes happening.
Yeah.
As though we had no idea what we were doing when we went into a place. I promise you, the sites were significantly studied and due diligence was done before they were recommended in the past. Sometimes we were caught off guard. One time when we were proposing to build in a sensitive location was Phoenix, Arizona temple in Glendale, in the city of Glendale, next to the Thunderbird State Park, across the street from it, which is a lovely desertscape natural preserve and a residential community, a nice residential community. But we owned a fair amount of ground next to an existing church meeting house that was proposed for the temple. Our first designs of the temple that we brought forward were of a 2-story temple, fairly small footprint to fit the small site, with a steeple. And the neighborhood pushed back and said, you're a little tall for us, because we're more modest and low lying in the way we develop our homes. And, oh, by the way, we have a dark sky ordinance that you want to be sensitive to. And they went so far, and I can't remember if it was 6,000 signatures or 10,000 signatures, but they managed to pass the word around and captured all of these signatures of concerned residents in the area who felt that as proposed, the temple would not be a good fit. We watched all that occur. We listened carefully. We went back and redesigned the temple and pushed as much of that temple underground as possible so that it's a single story with a modest spire that still maintained or actually enlarged, I think, slightly the capacity of the temple, but it's a very modest profile. And we shut the lights off early, much earlier than most temples, so the dark sky is absolutely unaffected. That was one of my favorite earlier examples of how you go into a community and you find out what their hot buttons are. And even where we had kind of a concept of here's what we'd like to do, how's it going to play? And they said, no, this isn't going to be right. So then we, instead of taking our standard plan temple and saying, but this is what we do, we went back and did a custom design, which will never be repeated anywhere else because it fit well in that location. And it's a lovely little temple.
Yeah, I love to hear that. And then it breaks my heart to hear that, because what has changed in a decade where the communities that Landon and I are involved with would absolutely love to be able to work with someone and come up with something like that. And they're not given that opportunity at all from their perspective and our perspective too. These, there is no budging. We have recorded conversations from church lawyers saying, we will not budge. We will not change. We have legal precedents protecting us. The way you're describing is how it should be done. They always say we want to be a good neighbor and a beloved, member of the community. That's exactly what you described. I think nobody could object to a temple like that at all. And yet you see location after location saying word for word what you just said. What about our skies? What about our height? Can't we do something different? So I just have to wonder what changed in the last, it's not that long, decade.
I could only
incredible.
speculate. Yeah, I could only speculate as to what on earth is going on right now, but it feels like posturing. My friend Lisa Downing wrote an interesting op-ed on it that basically said, it looks like the church is trying to do we're right, so we have might, as opposed to, might makes right. It's right makes might, and force these issues to prove some legal point, even if it has to go as high as the United States Supreme Court. These look like that they're trying to create some sort of legal precedent that further protects the church's ability to go into communities and do what they please. And I didn't ever experience that really in my time that I'm talking about of my career. We looked for 10 years for a site in Metro Paris before we found a community that was comfortable working with the LDS Church, an American church, in relatively sensitive architectural areas. And it just so happened where we landed in Le Chenet is right on the border of Versailles, the community of Versailles, where the historic property is there, the King's hunting palace. How did that work out? It worked out because there was an urban property available, and the community had a long, maybe 20-year experience with the Paris Stake Center being located in their community, and that the 20-year experience of the French Latter-day Saints had been positive in that one community, who knew the Mormons and knew us to be the kind of people that they could live and work with. And we weren't some American cult.
Right, exactly. Right. And what you built was beautiful and fit in and does not have a steeple. That's the thing.
We were told the only thing that gets higher than 15 meters in Le Chenet or any of those surrounding communities was the Catholic Church.
Right.
And you could see the Catholic Church steeple from everywhere. But we were told 15 meters, and it took a lot of creativity to develop, again, a custom plan that would capture the whole temple in 15 meters, which is approximately 45 feet in height.
But you adhered to what they wanted. That's the thing that's the key. And so when you hear now this, what we call the doctrine of the steeple, that every building must have a, steeple to draw you. I mean, you can speak to that because, in the past, at least, that wasn't, or was it? I mean, you tell us, what do you think about the doctrine of the steeple?
I think it's a lot of hoo-ha that has no historic background. I mean, think of all the lovely early 20th century temples that don't have steeples.
Yeah.
Laie, Cardston, Alberta, Mesa, Arizona, just really gorgeous buildings without steeples. We even did, besides Paris, which obviously doesn't have a steeple, we even did like Meridian in Idaho in like 2012, which is a beautiful temple. Doesn't really have a steeple. It just kind of crescendos up like a mountain. And steeples, Boston was dedicated without a steeple. We're all familiar with that story. They couldn't get it approved fast enough, and President Hinckley wanted Boston to be the 100th temple, and so he went ahead and dedicated it without its steeple. Eventually, like 4 years later, I got the assignment to take the original steeple design and install it on the temple.
Once it went through all the legal process.
Once it went through all of the legal.
It's so funny. I know you probably don't follow this like we do every town council meeting, but there was one meeting where they were trying to talk about the steeple doctrine, and a husband and wife got up, and the wife said, "I was married in the Boston temple when it didn't have a steeple. Was I married? Sure. But was my experience diminished? Yes, it was without the steeple." And then she kind of hit her husband, "Hold the picture up, honey," and it had a steeple. So, I mean, the lengths that some of these people will go to try to help everybody understand that they've got to have a steeple. It's just so fascinating to us when you're right. So many beautiful lower key temples that are just a beautiful part of the community. So
can you tell us when you're planning a temple, there's certainly got to be, these are the must-haves. And these are the nice to haves, or the, you have the flexibility, but we all know Salt Lake had all these Masonic symbols on them. We certainly don't see that anymore, but was there certain symbols that had to be put in the building? Obviously the baptisms fonts had to be underground and that kind of stuff, or do they always have to be underground?
Except where they weren't.
Except where they weren't. Okay. Well, what were the must-haves?
Well, a lot of them were just legendary. If we did anything that looked slightly symbolic under President Hinckley, he would look at that and say, "What is that?"
Interesting.
And it was like, "Well, this is symbolic of X, Y, and Z." And he said, I don't know that. Why should we do that? So that kind of stuff, like you see on the Salt Lake Temple, for example, no, that's really not a have to. I had an interesting experience constructing the Aba, Nigeria temple, which was actually one of the very last of the small 45. And probably most of the small 45 have a dimensional stone, which is a circle and inside of a square. Circle inside of a square, and it's plunked on in a couple of key places like there were capitals above the columns. Well, when those stones were carved in Johannesburg, South Africa for the Aba, Nigeria temple, and then shipped by boat all the way up, and then by truck up into the deep, not exactly woods, but jungle of Nigeria. And as those stones were being placed on the temple with their circles inside of squares, the local stake president was working on the property as a contracted landscape installer. And he looked up and saw that, and he ran quickly to the project manager's office and said, "You can't use those here because they were the symbol of some dark cult in Nigerian culture."
Wow.
And he knew that. And so the stones came down. We quickly reordered their replacements as blank squares.
Right.
And they were eventually installed on the temple. I can't even remember the question for, it was about symbols and things like that. What comes first? So again, the small 45, one of the things that made those temples less expensive is there's no basement. So you can't put the baptistry on the lowest level if there's no lower level. So I think it may be just down a slight ramp, about 6 inches. And that's where the main floor of the baptistry is, just barely by 6 inches below the floor line of the rest of the building. So is that important? Maybe it is important. For the longest time, and we tried even at Rexburg to ask President Hinckley if he would approve a second baptistry for Rexburg. And his response was, no, temples have one baptistry.
Really?
But not anymore.
Yeah,
Now
no,
there's some that are being announced.
Heber and Syracuse
Yeah.
has two.
And Landon, I think we sort of have speculated that is because it's important to get to the youth to the temple, and the youth are really the ones on temple trips and baptismal trips that are really massively attending. And the youth go on the trip, the leaders are invested, the parents are invested, everybody has to get a recommend. It really is an area where you see a lot of attendance. So, I mean, I think that's smart. Was Heber supposed to have one, Landon?
I think Heber was supposed to have two.
Exactly, to accommodate that. So yeah, we see youth temple trips as being a place where we all agree, yes, there is massive amounts of attendance for that, where there may not be for some of the other things that happen in the temple.
The irony behind that is, if you run the numbers, how many names, how many proxy names can you baptize for in 5 minutes?
Yeah, that's true.
Tons.
Yeah.
How long does it take to do the endowment session, even with the shortened sessions, for those 20 or so names? Hours and hours and hours and hours.
That is interesting.
Even 10, 15 years ago, one of the biggest challenges being faced by the leadership of the church was that we were running out of names to baptize. And there was a huge backlog trying to get through the endowment. And that was worldwide. It didn't matter where you were in the world, that you could baptize people far faster. The throughput of the baptistry was way faster than the rest of the temple, or all the temples combined, if they were open 24/7, which of course they're not. So the idea of building a second baptistry, yes, may on occasion accommodate large youth groups, but it actually is counterproductive to this challenge of not being able to find enough proxy names. Even
There's
with
so many repetition. There's so much repetition in baptism.
Even with our best modern technology, they were having difficulty providing sufficient names to the temple. My last few trips to the temple with youth groups from our stake in the Salt Lake Temple, they were limiting the youth to 1 or 2 names.
Interesting.
For the whole trip.
Whole trip.
And it got to be also to the point where you couldn't go on, to a baptistry as part of an individual party walking in unless you were bringing your own names.
You had to bring your own. I have the answer. You just need to change the endowment so a single person can go through for like 20 people, right? You as a living person go through for 20 people.
Yes.
That's what I'm saying. It seems like that could work, and then that would increase things 20-fold. I don't know if anyone's listening, strengthening the members committee, but that's my idea.
I think about all the discussions I sat through of the way that names move through temples and the challenges that were being faced so long ago. And I just can't imagine how more baptistries is doing anything other than what you described, Rebecca, giving opportunities to youth. But even back when we had, 15 years ago, if a youth gets dressed up and they travel 40 minutes to get to the temple and they get all changed and they get all wet and they're only doing 1 or 2 names, and then they get all changed back up and dry their hair and then head back home, they had the experience, but it seems like an awful lot of effort for 30 seconds in the font.
For the 2, that's right. But it's probably the whole experience. I mean, I and a lot of people of my age think fondly of those trips when it was literally out of state. I mean, I grew up in Washington, used to travel to Idaho Falls. It was a big old experience, with leaders and all kinds of activities. So I think that's probably, what they're going for. I was wondering if I could ask you about, I'm so curious now that we've kind of talked about the difference between the era you're describing, where almost bent over backwards to accommodate communities and town councils and city councils, and now this era where it seems to be different. But to me, the MTC project, which was one of your last ones, right? I think that you described, to me, that's kind of pivotal because, and I can't remember exact heights or anything, you could go into that, but the neighborhood the neighborhood, a predominantly LDS, said, please don't here. I remember them flying a giant balloon, and they obviously, in whatever they did, had an impact, because whatever you guys did, it wasn't what was originally planned. So I'd love to hear more about that, how community outreach and trying to help the church understand what the impact might be, it seemed to work in that situation.
Yeah, it was, if we're talking about impacting a community, probably the poster child for how to do this right is the expansion of the Provo Missionary Training Center. Built mostly in the early 70s and then added onto with a couple of additional buildings over the years. It sits in the midst of a very residential neighborhood, homes built in the 60s and 70s, maybe back even into the 50s, that had been occupied by, the most stalwart and faithful Latter-day Saints, many of them, former BYU professors or current BYU professors or their widows. It's just, that was the community. And at the time that this all started in 2012-ish, I'm thinking, Brigham Young University facilities management, physical facilities, had been maintaining and operating the MTC plant for dozens and dozens of years. And when it came time to talk about expanding the MTC, it was a Brigham Young University physical facilities project. And they came forward with a project recognizing that there was a limited amount of ground at the Missionary Training Center and a significant boost in program that they were being asked to consider. They proposed an 11-story tower in the middle of the facility.
I was thinking 8, and I thought even that was wrong. It was 11. Oh my goodness.
We're talking about a place where maximum height of buildings were 3 short stories, kind of tucked in amongst a lot of 1.5-story tall houses with, low slung mid-century modern roofs.
Yeah, the 70s, 60s houses.
Yeah, exactly. An 11-story tower, which, would have been taller than anything anywhere in Utah County, I think, and would have been more prominent than the former Provo Temple that sat high up on the hill above the MTC.
I remember them saying, our gardens won't grow anymore. You don't understand the shadow. It's just so massive.
Well, the community, as you've alluded to, Rebecca, came out in force against their neighbor and their faith tradition, the institutional church.
Wow.
I scratched my head when I heard about this the first time. I thought, 11 stories, that means you've got missionaries on stairs or in elevators constantly. And just the vertical transportation issues of an 11-story building for, 20,000 missionaries was not a good idea.
Yeah.
It was a bad idea. And yes, of course, I'm not so sure that people's gardens would have been shadowed that badly, but it was the wrong thing to do. Right. And all of the hoo-ha that took place, and in this case, again, the right creates might attitude that Brigham Young University took towards their surrounding community, ultimately caused church headquarters to take the project away from BYU and give it to physical facilities at church headquarters, which became me, director of special projects at that point. And so I inherited all the bad will, all the ill will that BYU had created. And so we started a process as we were developing our guidelines to design a much more sane and sensitive facility. We started a process where we went down into elementary schools all around the MTC campus and met with the local residents. And they came out in force to talk to all of us new folk who are coming to talk about this project. And before we put any pencil to paper, we held long local community meetings in these elementary school cafeterias and such, and libraries, listening to all of these folks share the promises that President Kimball had made to them when the Missionary Training Center was originally built, and all of these things, which, I brought a fair amount of respect to that conversation. And I didn't have a dog in the fight at that point because I wasn't married to a design that we hadn't done yet. I just knew we weren't going to do that 11-story tower.
Mm-hmm.
And we listened until they believed that we really cared. And we took back to our leadership at headquarters what ultimately became a master plan, which required expanding into, ironically, some of BYU's ancillary facilities, the old laundry and print factory and all of, whatever things we wound up taking from BYU and having them build elsewhere so that the MTC could expand its ground. As it did so downhill. We were able to slip in 5 and then 6-story buildings downhill that when you stood on the roof of those new buildings, you weren't any higher than the roof of the 3-story buildings that were uphill. And so and they were away from the neighborhood. They were towards the university campus and tucked in around other existing university buildings in a way that ultimately, from the community's perspective, created a sensitive and beautiful response. And one that really made the whole effort of what's going on inside that facility more of a beacon, to the community that this is missionary work churning away, but we didn't do it
alienating a community, right?
Yeah, we didn't do it in the face of our neighbors.
Yeah. That's why that's beautiful. But let me just say this really quickly. It makes me really, really devastated for the communities that we work with when you say we listened and listened until they knew that we cared, because none of these communities that we're talking to feel that way at all. They've had lawyers out of the gate threaten them. They've had no representation with any power, no representative with any power come that can listen. And so to hear how it should be done, how it was done, just wish I knew what to do to make it that way again, because I feel like it could be a win-win for everyone. So I love that. I love that you sensed we just have to love everybody until we come up with a solution altogether. And then that reflects the purpose of the MTC. So wonderful story, but really sad to me because that's not what's happening now. Sorry, Landon, go ahead. I just had that thought.
I was going to say basically the same thing you did, but then I was going to ask, what do you say to these residents? Most of these are outside of Utah per se, and most of the residents around are not LDS, and it seems like the church listens when the neighbors are LDS, and it threatens the internal harmony of the church, but they seem to care less when it's residents who are not LDS, and they start labeling them anti-Mormon and bigots simply because they want the same thing the people at the MTC wanted, which is just a livable space with a building that fits in with their community.
Well, listening worked in the non-LDS community of Glendale, Arizona.
Yeah.
We weren't surrounded by a whole bunch of Latter-day Saint homes there either. I mean, the scenario that I'm describing, whether it's Phoenix Temple or the Provo MTC, it's just good design professionalism, to work in harmony with your context. And your context includes, in certain cases, families in their homes, and businesses in the community, and natural resources like the Thunderbird State Park. That's just good design professionalism, to work in harmony with those things rather than against those things to prove a point.
Yeah. And unfortunately, the answer that they give these residents over and over is God told us to put it here. There's nothing we can do. And
right makes might.
Yes, exactly. That doesn't seem to have been anything that you guys even entertained saying to anybody those years ago, but that is the answer now. And the residents we work with are like, I don't know what to say to them when they say their God wants to put it here, because whatever you say then starts to sound a little combative, but they're kind of combative to you. So it's really hard to know even how to talk to some of these residents and help them understand the LDS perspective. And I tried to tell them, there's something different going on now. It was not this way before. It really wasn't. But
it really wasn't.
God told us, get in line. I mean, it's that clear, which I don't know how you react to that.
I think some of the confusion is they don't know who to talk to, because there isn't an architect there
So
asking
there's no
anything.
decision maker
Yeah,
that
there's no
interacts with
decision
these
maker, and they all
residents.
say, "Oh, we'll get with Salt
Yeah.
Lake and get back to you." And no one even knows who they're
Yeah.
talking to, and they're going, "What if we write a letter?"
Yeah,
And
they
it's
ask
like,
us,
"Who'd
do
you
you
write
have
a
a phone
letter
number for the
to?"
prophet? I know. And it's so funny because initially they all think, oh, we're going to work with the bishop. They think a bishop is a bishop. And then we explain, no, that's just, one of your neighbors that's serving in a calling. But yeah, they're so blind. They have no recourse, no one to reach out to. They deal with lawyers, and that becomes very impersonal and negative very quickly. And just to hear the way you describe loving the people, my heart aches for everybody that's not experiencing that and is just having, and what you say is so true. It's their homes that they're defending, that they're concerned about. It's their family, their lifestyle, that's very personal, and I just,
We often went into communities, non-LDS communities. I don't remember ever bringing a lawyer in first.
really,
And when I say I was there, it was myself and a real estate colleague, maybe a couple of others. Yeah, they were talking to the people who were making the design decisions and dealing with the purchases of property and so forth. We often, I think we even had a little pamphlet at one time that explained that temples are good for neighborhoods. They're good neighbors, and spelled out, the reasons why. And,
yeah,
you
I think they
know,
were.
and in some cases, I think people looked at that and said, I'm thinking back to maybe like Fort Lauderdale and Orlando in Florida, as those temples came in, those communities raised up in relationship to the temple that was built around them, because it was a good neighbor, beautiful grounds, quiet activities, nice surroundings, raising property value. We
All
had
those
to,
are true. Yeah,
yeah,
all those are true.
we had to prove to the mayor and the city of Philadelphia that the temple and the amount of vehicle trips and so forth coming to this urban location, and then people going out and having lunch after their temple session, and all of the workmen who would be involved in building these buildings for several years, that really represented an economic boost to the community, where they had a redevelopment property that had been sitting for 40 years, accomplishing absolutely nothing. They then would have a beautiful site that brought people to this place that might not otherwise come downtown. And they would shop and they would eat after they participated in their temple ordinances. It just blows my mind that we would be so bullheaded to walk in. I say we as though I was still part of it.
I know we all say we.
Walk into a community and say, our God wants to put us there. Did we not learn anything about land development in Independence, Missouri in 1833?
Yep. Those are the comparisons we make. You're right.
Do we not understand that you just don't march into a community and say, this is our promised land, everybody bug out,
Yeah.
Yep, that's what's happening. I mean, I think about Fairview from the initial interaction. They received a flyer saying that there was going to be a 2-story church building being built. And of course, that's not accurate. And then they went to a meeting, and the lawyer addressed them and said, the Department of Justice is going to sue you if you don't let us build what we want. This is the initial meeting with the church, the very first impression. And we have a recorded, somebody had it in their purse, and you can hear the residents go, oh, there's whispering, there's this, sound of audible. Did he say they're going to sue? This is the very first meeting. And I don't know how they would expect it to be any different than it is now from that initial push in, it's heartbreaking.
So a couple of other funny related stories come to mind about temples that I was a part of. When we went to Twin Falls, Idaho, originally, we brought in a design with a 161-foot high steeple on a 2-story building, recognizing that in that 50-50 LDS community, we might get some pushback on the height. And we actually had a design, ready to go with something like a 135-foot tower. And we went up there and we made the presentation to the completely non-LDS planning commission. And they looked at the design and said, you know what, you'll be able to see this from the interstate highway for miles. And it really puts Twin Falls on the map. You can build your temple here, but that steeple cannot be any shorter than what you're showing now. And we went home thinking, well, I guess we're building 161 feet.
Every town is different. That's the whole point.
Interesting turn of events.
That's so funny.
And to back up your thought that once a groundbreaking ceremony takes place, can a temple get moved? It happened in Tegucigalpa, Honduras. Oh. We announced the temple. We had a church purchase site next to a church institute building and in a prominent location. And we had it fully designed on that site. The groundbreaking took place. I think we started moving dirt to construct the foundations. We were allowed to move the dirt without a permit, but we couldn't place any concrete until we had our permit in hand. But we were doing all the preparatory site work to get ready for this. So the church had invested some time and money in this location, as well as some public PR in creating a groundbreaking ceremony, which was attended by saints from all over Honduras. And we finally got someone in the local church hierarchy to talk seriously with the mayor of Tegucigalpa at the time. And we were led to understand that if we stayed on that property, the church would never receive a building permit. But they would be really happy to give us a building permit if we would move to this side of the city. And they would help us just kind of get this all facilitated. The problem was where we were building the temple was about a half a mile and a direct sight line to the largest basilica in Honduras.
Oh.
And we thought it was a cool site. Apparently Catholics long before us also thought it was a cool area of town, but there was just enough community sentiment that they didn't want the basilica and the temple talking to each other. And they just didn't want us there, but they didn't come right out and tell us they didn't want us there. They just weren't going to ever let us be there. But even after we did all of these things. So I received the assignment from the presiding bishopric to go down to Tegucigalpa, to the other side of town, and crawl all over an alternate property and determine if we could build the temple there and if it would be, a good site. I went back, gave my report, said this would be a really good site for alternate site for the temple, and that's where it sits today. Literally across the valley.
You have dogs like we have dogs. That's fine.
Literally across the valley, several miles from the basilica, the Catholic basilica, but also in a very lovely, prominent corner of the valley that can be seen from everywhere. And it turned out to be a delightful temple site. So can you hold a groundbreaking and then move a temple? Yeah, you bet.
Yes, you can. And it reminds me of, we talked to somebody who had interviewed a temple construction person in Peru and has kind of a transcript of this interview. And the person said, yeah, it's harder internationally here because, the towns, the cities, they do make their rules. We don't have something like RLUIPA. We don't have any kind of legal protections that allow us to build on paper, maybe whatever we want. And then he said, in the US, it's easy. We plop down in residential areas. We can always get it. He said this in a transcript, so It is very different internationally. I see that you do have to be careful. You have to follow the laws of the land. Here in the United States, like this guy said, we just plop down right there. There's nothing you can say in another country that says, we're going to sue you if, but here you can use that. So that's a huge part of it. I have to tell you something funny that I just heard yesterday having to do with temples. I was talking to a friend who's in Dubai. And of course, that temple was announced in 2020, and it was supposed to be part of a big, it was called like Expo 2020. Of course, COVID kind of, did away with that, but it's still kind of on the books. And this friend told me that the church leaders that he's talking with there, just local people that he knows with, he says they're in the know. I don't know if this is true or not, but he said the church has put forward designs there in District 2020 of Dubai, and they have said, that's not tall enough. That's not light enough. That's not ornate enough. We
Right.
need this to be, and I wonder what you think about that. I just think it's so ironic, but maybe not really. It has to do with fitting into where you go. And in this city, they're like, we are a tourist area. It has to be huge and grand. So I made some AI of it just to see what it looked like, a Dubai like temple. But I don't know. What do you think of that? It's anecdotal. I'm not sure if it's true or not, but
It may be. I can remember toying with ideas in other major East Asian cities, for example, where, if we took every possible thing that we would want to have in a center of population for a church in a country, in a region of the world, all of the church education offices, the family history departments, and all of the the mission home, the mission offices, missionary apartments. And if we just kept stacking them up and put the, meeting house upon meeting house upon meeting house, and on the top we set the temple in this one lovely, graceful tower,
wow.
Could we justify taking all of the possible properties we might have in a city and putting them in one spot? Could we create a temple tower?
That's crazy. A temple tower. Oh, wow.
Yeah. And, rarely did that ever pan out right.
Yeah.
But
I tried that in Babel. It didn't work very well.
Yeah.
There you go, Landon. That's it.
Yep. You step through the veil and suddenly you actually are in heaven.
I've got a question. This is, and I don't know if you were involved at this level or not, but one of the criticisms in Vegas is that they came in and they the church's law firm donated $10,000 to each city council person, the law firm representing the church in the land acquisition, and then we also saw that that the city codes got changed in a way that would accommodate the temple where it wouldn't have been accommodated previously. And all these changes happened before there was ever an announcement of the temple coming. I'm guessing in some of these third world countries, there might have to be some level of engagement with the government that, maybe isn't the way you deal with business in the United States. Did you ever see any of that type of thing going on in order to get a temple put in where there was non-transparency behind the scenes to make it happen?
It sounds like somebody had done their pre-preparation work in Las Vegas. It still didn't pan out, did it?
Well,
no, it did. They got it approved.
They did.
But there's still a lawsuit. There's still a lawsuit brought by the residents. But still voted.
Yeah. So Landon, to get to your point, in the circles that I functioned, and I didn't function in those political circles typically, but in the circles where I functioned, where I was hiring contractors and consultants to do work on temples in some of the rougher economic places in the world. When we built the temple complex in Nigeria, Nigeria was the number one most corrupt country in the world in which to do business. By the time we got to Kyiv, Ukraine, it had replaced Nigeria. Ukraine had replaced Nigeria as the number one most corrupt place in the world. So we did back-to-back number one most corrupt places in the world. But the mantra that we always kept was, we build the temple by coming in through the front door. We don't do any backdoor stuff. We taught our contractors that regardless of how you've worked, the firm from Austria that built the temple in Ukraine, the temple complex in Ukraine, had done work in the former Soviet Union, in the Moscow area, in the Kyiv area, going back to before the fall of the Soviet Union. They had been very successful in getting work done. I didn't question them about how they got their work done, but we explained to them in very, very clear language that in this case, you're building a house of the Lord. And, if people are looking for graft, or for, greasing of the skids, we don't do that. We'll be patient until we work through the processes. It just so happens that in that same time frame, I adopted a daughter from Ukraine, and all along the way, the only way we got through all the paperwork and got to meet our daughter and then ultimately to have the courts buy into us taking her out of the country was our interpreter was, slipping them a little bit of money everywhere along the way. Everybody that we spoke to got their little piece of the action. But I also explained to our contractor, I don't want to hear this happening. I don't want you to be doing it and have me find out later that you were slipping officials money to get this thing approved. We're going to get it through the front door. Ultimately, they were a strong enough company and had enough integrity. Thank goodness that I believe that was done according to our intentions. I do know in Aba, Nigeria, one of the things that helped us and helped the community was from the central square in Aba, which was in really kind of rough shape. It had kind of fallen into disrepair after the Brits moved out in the early 60s. But from the central square in Aba out to the property that the church owned where the temple site was going to be constructed, the church built a new road, a nice wide 2-lane asphalt highway, the nicest road in the region, park strips and sidewalks in between the rows of, tumble down houses where the dirt road used to go, and a new bridge across the Aba River up to the hill where the temple site was. That helped the community because they got a beautiful new road. It helped the community want to work with us because we had made an investment in their infrastructure. I think we may have also had to run some pipes and some electricity out that road. The city named it Temple Road, and it benefited us because we couldn't get trucks across the Aba River by fording the river, that were hauling heavy building materials and concrete and so forth. So we really needed to have the road and the bridge built. But it was like an all in all, everybody wins. It was a win-win situation. Was that a means to pay graft to the city? But it really wasn't. It was about making a contribution that benefited us all. And the beautiful thing about that was when we came back a year or two after the road was finished, all the property owners along that road had started fixing up their walls and planting, their yards a little bit, natural things, and just everything started to spruce up along Temple Road because people suddenly took some pride in their property because it was on this road that the church had built for them. So
that's how it should be. I mean, That is honestly how it should be, giving back to the whole community. It makes me think of Nauvoo, Landon. We did an episode on the visitor center that they built there right by the Nauvoo temple, and just kind of learned by talking to some of the locals about the history of the church, improving buildings and things there. And one thing they said is, well, they don't pay taxes, of course, into the town, and yet, so many tourists, but they said they would offer to improve things, and they would build a road right to where their property ended. And then they would let the rest of the road just be. And the people are like, we just don't understand that. So to hear a story like yours, that is how it should be. That is how they should do it everywhere, because then the town is, it just improves everything and it just increases exponentially. So this whole thing is making me crazy because there's so many good things that can happen. You describe these situations where it's done right. Let's do it right all the time. It's just going to benefit. And I know that's probably simplistic and naive, but when you hear your stories where it really was a good neighbor and a blessing in these communities, it can be, it really can.
Yeah, that road in Nigeria in Aba wasn't a short quarter-mile strip. It's about 2 miles long.
Oh, wow.
It was a good long road that kind of down and crossed the river and went back up the other side. It was a big deal.
Yeah, boy. So you're a temple constructor, a road constructor, you do it all.
We build everything.
You build everything.
We build it everywhere.
Wow, what a career.
Unfortunately, no more. My heart breaks to see some of the debacles that are taking place.
I know. I wonder if you were still employed there and you saw this kind of thing start to happen. What would your take be? I mean, would you try to question why, or what would you, or try to make a difference from within? I mean, I have to think that there are people in the temple building infrastructure, there must be hundreds of employees, that some people see this and just are kind of heartbroken like I am at what's happening to these towns, fabric of community, that kind of thing.
I know many of my former colleagues that are still there who haven't reached retirement yet, who I imagine, like myself, feel just overwhelmed and heartbroken to see some of the things that have been taking place. I worked hard during my tenure working with the senior brethren to be respectful towards them, but also be incredible enough that I could confront them with an alternate opinion. And they didn't see it as criticism or harmful pushback. I was really able to say some things to them that they didn't want to hear. Nobody wanted to hear that the Salt Lake Temple was going to crumble in a seismic event. But now you see what's happening as a result of my taking that presentation forward in 2007. So I did reach the point on a couple of occasions where I saw something really wrong taking place. I note one or two of those in the memoir. And ultimately, it cost me my assignment in a couple of cases. And I wound up getting pushed aside a little bit. There is a breaking point, and it takes a careful dance to not cross the wrong people at church headquarters when you're in the process of sharing best professional judgment, the best facts that you could. If you were cross-threaded with certain middle-level general authorities, or if somehow you really managed to offend the First Presidency, which I never did, it could, you could suddenly get a mission president assignment in Zimbabwe or something.
That's how they get rid of people, huh? Mission president.
Okay, you're out of here for 3 years.
You're out. Yeah, we've suspected that for a while.
Yeah, preach the gospel, don't die. But I'm sure, and I've said this to a few people, that if I were there still, I'm sure I would have lost my job over the demolition of the interior of the historic Salt Lake Temple.
I know.
I would not have tolerated that, and I probably would have been reassigned to Kathmandu. Just there are certain things that, and I describe a few of them, like I said in the memoir, where I just couldn't tolerate not being heard. And if I pushed too hard, I wound up doing something else, and then make the best of that. But I've got to believe that many of my old colleagues are seeing these things and struggling as well.
Yeah.
What do you attribute, speaking of the leadership and the changes and things that have happened in the last 10 years, what do you attribute this huge number of temple building projects, 300 or 350 now? What do you attribute that to from an insider who has seen things? Did you feel we need 350 temples, or what's your take on that?
Well, I have, as you can imagine, I have a whole lot of takes. I'm going to try to take them through bullet point fashion. 350 temples or 1,000 temples was what President Hinckley had in mind when the 45 were announced. His plan wasn't to just do 45 of them and be done. His plan was to make the temple totally accessible anywhere there was a stake in the world, I believe. And those little temples were to populate communities all over the globe. That was his vision. It didn't work out. Why was that? How was that his vision? His vision was that local saints could operate a simple little temple, and people could go and receive their ordinances and participate and work for the dead. And then at the evening, after the session, they'd run the vacuum cleaner for a couple minutes, throw out the lights, and everybody'd head home. That was a lovely idea, which didn't even survive during his lifetime. And we started building bigger temples that were more onerous to run and more difficult and required staff and a lot more people to justify and all of these things. That's one point. If you wanted a lot of temples, there was a right way to do that. They're not doing that now. So next point is, and we talked about this when we met for supper a week ago, and that is, how many temples does the current program have the capacity to construct and dedicate each year? And my recollection is that we felt like we were really humming if we got 5 or 6 dedications in a year. I don't know if either of you have looked up what's happened in the last 10 years, but what's been the rate of temple dedications per year?
It's similar to that. You
5 to
pointed that
6.
out. Yeah, which is because so many announcements, so much buzz, everything but actual dedications. You pointed that out to us, and I had not realized that.
So if you think about that, that means that the effective machine that we were able to put in place 20 years ago hasn't been scaled up in any particular way to handle a much larger construction program and dedication program, because I believe there's still a need for it to be controlled centrally. And until the idea that temples and temple construction can take place in a decentralized worldwide fashion, being controlled by local area offices around the world, I don't think the capacity, the pipeline capacity to get temples to the other end and to reach dedication has changed. You're kind of validating that I was right in guessing that that was the case. So if that's the case, and you're announcing 15 to 25 temples a year or more.
Yeah, I think they're 30 because they do about 15 every 6 months.
Yeah.
15 to 25 every 6 months. If you're looking at 40 to 50 new temple announcements each year, and you can only get 5 out the other end of the pipe, how many years of backlog do we already have to get to the 350th one? The next several church presidents maybe, and maybe that's what they're thinking. I don't know.
Maybe.
But the next several church presidents in succession could stop announcing temples for 20 years. And there'd still be announced temples, that were coming out of the end of the pipe. Not all of those that have been announced are in places where we presently probably have the ability to permit a temple. Moscow comes to mind.
Yeah.
Shanghai, I think.
Or
Shanghai
China, that was just
list.
taken off the list. We just picked up on that. It's gone now.
The sad thing is that temple announcements, which used to be something that was an indication of progress in the church and of an exciting growth pattern in the church, have really become, whatever. Yeah, okay, 25 more.
Yeah.
What cities are those? Places we'd never heard of before.
And I feel like local leaders are kind of quaking in their boots when it's announced, because in many cases they're like, how are we going to
do that?
Staff this or clean this? There's another temple just there. Yeah, I feel like it's I just got an email today. We need people to clean the temple. Please come tonight at 3:00. Like, I've got a podcast. I can't. Well, plus I don't have a recommend, but still,
Right.
It's nice of them to think of me.
Right. I actually happen to live in Louisville, and back when I was attending the church, the ward in which I live is co-located with the Louisville, Kentucky temple. And so I drive by that little guy every day, and members of the ward who are my friends, they're ordinance workers, they're temple cleaners, they're doing all of those lovely things that were envisioned. But that's our own little community taking care of that temple that serves a couple of stakes in Kentucky and southern Indiana. I remember when we were first going to Winnipeg, Manitoba, there was one stake in Manitoba, the Winnipeg stake, and there were roughly 400 temple recommend holders in Manitoba. And you think about how often those 400 temple recommend holders were going to drive, in winter weather, to get to the temple. I think probably most of them lived in Metro Winnipeg, but there may have been a few that were farther out, but a very, very small collection of saints who, until that temple was ultimately built, were driving to Saskatchewan or Toronto, to go to the temple. So from one point of view, from the point of view of not having the saints traveling hundreds and hundreds of miles across, the Great Plains snowstorms to get to a temple. But then how do these 400 Latter-day Saints, which probably represent about 200 or 250 households, how do they care for and operate the tiny little temple that was ultimately built for them? It's tricky. And, the same things occur in a lot of places. I don't know if you've looked at this, but the theory is that a temple was never announced until there was a stake created.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if you've looked at it to see if the 350 locations actually have stakes.
No.
And if that's the case, they've changed the paradigm, because a temple doesn't get located until there's a stake of Zion established, was the theory. And if you throw that theory out and you just start announcing cities in the world willy-nilly, where's the stake? Where's the maturity of leadership that it takes to—
That's a great point.
To operate that? I mean, one of the great blessings was Kyiv, Ukraine was the first, if not the first, it was one of the first stakes created east of the Iron Curtain in the former Soviet Union. I think it was the first stake created in the former Soviet Union. And that meant at that time that a temple could be considered. It was if then, kind of a situation.
Yeah.
And, you have a maturity level when you get to a point where you're a stake and you've got the level of priesthood leadership and so forth that entails, that then can support the work of a temple. But even then, I know I'm rambling, but I'm throwing out everything
so
that's coming into my head.
Yeah.
Even then, a lot of the temples that we constructed in various places, and I'm thinking in this case, like Copenhagen, Denmark, that was a temple that was open, I think, for one session on a Tuesday and maybe a couple sessions, endowment sessions, on Saturday. Maybe one on Friday night. But you spend all of this effort to create a temple in a fairly good sized Western city like Copenhagen, and the most it can hope to accommodate are 4 small sessions in a week. The level of attendance at a lot of the temples outside of the Wasatch Front is very small. And, and again, as I mentioned, I drive by the Louisville Temple every day. And for the most part, there aren't any cars in the parking lot. There's a couple sessions in weekday evenings, and there's a few sessions on a Saturday. Most of these temples in various lower density populations of Latter-day Saints are for a handful at the most endowment sessions or sealing sessions in a week.
Yeah. And I think that's where being for show kind of plays into it, just to have a presence of the LDS. But that's frustrating to us because the church in each one of these cities that we're kind of working closely with tells them we are overflowing. We are turning people away from the temples that are near here, and I'll go on and I'll look at sessions and I'll say to the residents, no, look, it's empty. They don't know what to do about that. They don't know what's an exaggeration, what's a lie, but they're being told, the bursting at the seams. And so they must, and then the residents feel guilty. Well, how can we oppose this if they really need it? They're still trying to be community minded. And It makes me frustrated because they're not being given the correct information. And I even found a video where President Oaks says, I wish it were as easy to fill them as it is to build them. And so to me, it's kind of like a field of dreams sort of a thing. Let's build it and then let's hope they'll come. Where you're absolutely right. It used to be, oh my gosh, a temple means we have grown and we have so many people in this area. And that's what people were excited about. Now it's kind of like, that's interesting. Somebody said about the new Summit, New Jersey temple, they must be really excited there. And someone wrote back, yeah, both of the members are, which is extreme, but the sentiment that you describe is there, so, but they're certainly painting that picture that every temple is overflowing at the seams. So residents, how dare you stand in our way, and these real people that need to get in. So
we looked at the combination of throughput of the temples and how big of a temple we should build for certain levels of throughput. And then we looked at the data. The temple department has all the data on how many sessions are being run, how many people are in those small sessions. And the general utilization is the right word of the temples was so incredibly small in most places outside of the Wasatch Front that it was hard to understand why on earth we were going to such lengths to build even the ones we had. Perhaps you're familiar with the Birmingham, England temple situation that Peter Bleakley reported on. I think that you announced the Birmingham temple, and within a couple of weeks, some wards were dissolved and an estate was collapsed.
Yeah.
Which is it? Are we
which is
or are
it?
we
That's
shrinking?
right.
Yeah.
Well, I think internally we understand the shrinkage, but when a building is built, externally people go, oh, they must be doing very well. Look at their beautiful, grand buildings. So I really feel a lot of it is for show, but I don't know. It's definitely on a trajectory that none of us foresaw. And there's so much collateral damage in the wake of it that it's painful, I think. So I think maybe one of our last questions, since we could talk to you forever. We're getting up on 2 hours. I'm like, do you realize it's that, Landon? It's like going like that just because we're so riveted. She's like, time out. Do you need to take a time out really quick?
No,
you're just going time out.
We are reaching the end of this episode.
We are reaching the end. So I think I have one last question, and you had kind of alluded to it before, sort of about the legal motivations for everything that's happening. That's about the only thing that we can think of why, continue with these, such negative reactions from communities and community relations. And you had alluded to before, just this idea of, perhaps forcing a hand legally. Maybe you can just, in layman's terms, kind of explain a little bit about that and what you think that might mean, or possibly what they might be doing. We just are still trying to scratch our heads and figure it out.
And I was going to add to that, RLUIPA, and was the church behind that? We know it was introduced by Orrin Hatch. Were you aware of any
Bob Bennett
of that and it getting introduced from higher in the church, or where the RLUIPA
anything you want to add about the legal aspect?
My personal opinion, I wasn't involved in that ruling, but my personal opinion is that yes, absolutely, those senators were doing the church's bidding. Again, that's just a personal opinion. I didn't witness anything of it, but let me say this about RLUIPA, and that is, although we understood it as design professionals and real estate professionals in church physical facilities, we knew what it meant and how it could be used. I can only remember one instance in my 20 years of working with the church where it was even considered in a meeting to bring up, and that was Phoenix. And I've already explained to you how we resolved Phoenix without having to throw down our trump card. Pardon the expression.
Yeah, pardon. See, that's incredible to me, just because in the introductory packets that the church gives out now to towns, there's a huge section about RLUIPA and the DOJ. I mean, that's their calling card.
That's their lead.
It used to be a trump card. Now it is the calling card, knock, knock, RLUIPA,
RLUIPA.
So
we didn't in all the years of all the huge buildings that we built in all these cities all around the country, because RLUIPA doesn't exist worldwide, did we ever apply it. And only once did we discuss the possibility of using it, and we decided not to.
So do you think that is the end game here, is to try to shore up religious protections so that anything can be built anywhere at any time? I mean, do you think that's a possibility, or am I just a conspiracy theorist?
Well, I'll join you in that conspiracy theory because I can think of no other good reason for all of this malarkey to be occurring other than the fact that perhaps the senior functioning attorney in the church just wants to build this case and get it so rigidly defined that we can really march in and do anything we want anywhere. I can see no other reason for the disregard that's being demonstrated on the part of the church for local conditions and local people and local laws.
Yeah, we're right there with you, and a lot of other people too, having analyzed everything. And I just question, is that really worth it as an end game? Because I think it was a time where the temple, a Hinckley era 45, coming to your town, oh, this will be a nice addition. This will be a beloved place. And now we have people. I mean, I have people contacting me all the time. Hey, I heard there was an announcement. I'm not a Mormon. How do I find out? What are they doing? Are they coming? It's getting ready, which that is not what the church intended. I don't think that's what they want. Even if they could win, beat it down, build the temple, what's the end game? Unless the end game is just so far in the future. And I've heard this too, that these little altercations in a couple decades, the residents of Cody will forget. It won't matter. We have the temple, not the here and now, but eye on the future maybe. But to me, that's just so wrong. It's just
That's so wrong.
so heartbreaking. These are real people in real towns with real lives in real homes. And it doesn't have to be that way. I think we all see that.
If I could say one more thing, and it would be, if the word Mormon, if the name Mormon or the nickname Mormon is a victory for Satan, what is all the contention representative of? Contention is of the devil.
Yep.
This is not the Lord's work going forward this way, not as I understood it.
Yep. And I don't think not as you implemented it, because I can tell that you built these buildings with love, and you built them for this wonderful purpose and for people and for communities, and that shows through in everything that you said today. So this is amazing.
Yeah, we've been very impressed as we've gotten to visit with you and at dinner, and then in the interview we had that'll be airing later.
Yeah.
Just such an impressive life, and your book that's coming out.
Let's hold it up again, everybody. As we
just talked. This is interesting. Yeah. There's a whole nother side here of your story that's in the book about your whole transition and how that went over in the church and in your job. All in here, just another fascinating. You are just full of fascinating things, and like you said, a woman's perspective on being a high priest in the Mormon Church. You don't get that very often, and it was really fun to have that discussion and understand. You were a stake president, a bishop, you were ecclesiastical leaders, and not just the temple architect. You were both sides of that, so you really have a perspective that you bring that no one else in the world can bring. So just fascinating. And we've really enjoyed your time and appreciated it.
Yep. We have.
By the way, linking our subjects together, Hartford, Connecticut Temple, which I designed.
I didn't realize that. There it is. Oh my goodness. It's because my fingers are always covering it. There it is. So that's right.
Everybody, that's the current temple that's closest to my hometown.
And that's the one. And as you said, more temple stories in here that we did not spoil by this episode. So nope, I absolutely echo what Landon said. I don't know that we've had a guest where, like you said, we went out to dinner, we had an interview that Landon and I keep talking about our discussions that we've had and the things that came up. We keep rehashing that and going over it because everything was so fascinating. And now you've just given us 2 more hours of such amazing things to talk about. So I absolutely know that our viewers and listeners are going to be just absolutely enchanted with everything about this discussion. I want all of you guys right now, you can pre-order. Let's get this book from number 9 to number 1 within the next couple. I know it'll probably already be 1 by the time we air this. We'll air it a week from when we're taping it. But this book is going to change the world. That's kind of how I feel about this book. It's pretty amazing. So please comment, everybody, and let us know what you thought about this whole talk about temples and everything. And just the perspectives that were shared. I think were just amazing. We'd love to hear what all of you think. Please like and subscribe to Mormonish Podcast. And if you'd like to be made aware of when new episodes come out, you can hit that notification bell. If you would like to help financially support the podcast, we do have links in the show notes to Donor Box. We're a 501(c), and we appreciate each and every one of you that do help us out financially. It allows us to continue to, what do they always say at Mormonism Live? Keep the lights on, right? And have amazing guests like Laurie Lee Hall. And we're not kidding about that. So we also have links in the show notes to our merch store where you can pick up some Mormonish merchandise. And again, just thank you so much for being here and spending your time twice with us. This is amazing. We've done back to back. I feel like there's even more to talk about. We may have to do a revisit it after the book comes out and talk about, and some of the things that are happening, because I'm guessing when it comes out, you might be coming back, doing some signings and things like that. So yeah, it's been just lovely and wonderful to get to know you. So thank you so much. And thanks to all of you, our viewers and listeners. And we will see you all next time on Mormonish. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Mormonish. We really appreciate our listeners and would love to hear from you if you have a story you'd like to share. You can email us at mormonishpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and on our website, mormonishpodcast.org. And don't forget to look for us on YouTube and like and subscribe. Keep joyful, everybody.